Okay. Good morning. My name is Ian McSalley, and I am a bioinformatician working in the McKee Lab at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And I'm eager to present to you today my talk, Quantitative EEG Biomarkers of Severity in Syngap-related disorders. A quick overview of my talk. I want to give you a quick background on EEG and some of our quantitative or QEEG measures we're using in our analysis. I'll broadly define what an EEG biomarker might look like and look at some of the data that was published from our group earlier this year, though after the last talk that might look a little familiar. And lastly, I will give you an overview of some of our latest efforts in exploring correlations between outcome measures and spectral features in EEG and Syngap. So first, a quick intro into EEG and some of our QEEG approaches. A brief overview of scalp EEG. This is a test involving the placement of small electrodes on the small electrodes on the subject's scalp with the goal of measuring the electrical activity of the brain. It is a totally non-invasive procedure which gives us insights into the underlying neurophysiology of the examinee. The electrical signal measured by each electrode is recorded and can be either examined visually by a medical examiner or analyzed via computational methods to study patterns of activity. These can be performed both clinically and in a normal course of patient care or on a research basis. So here on the left, I'm showing you a short EEG recording of a healthy teenager. Each line shown here is in a bipolar montage representing the difference in voltage recorded by two adjacent electrodes. Typically, in clinical practice, electrodes will be arranged in the 10-20 system as shown here on the right, with the head pointed towards the top of the screen. There are many measures that can be used in QEEG analyses, but for now, our work focuses mostly on spectral features. Oh man, that's kind of a thing. Okay. So at the top of the left graphic, we have the electrical signal recorded by a single electrode. By performing what we call a fast Fourier transformation, we can decompose the signal into the power contributed by the underlying frequency components or power bands. For example, in this illustration, we would say that the delta power band is composed of all frequencies between 1 and 4 hertz, representing the slowest brain waves. We can measure the power contributed by these power bands as is, or divided by the total power of the signal, which will give us the relative power. And lastly, by considering the placement of the electrode on the scalp, we can group electrodes to get spatial contextualization for these power bands, or ratios that we measure. So for example, if we compare the alpha and delta power bands recorded from channels 01 and 02, seen here at the bottom of the screen, we would have the occipital alpha-delta ratio. So that was a quick crash course on spectral features in QEEG, and next I'll talk broadly about what comes to mind when we think about a biomarker and show some of our work that our group published earlier, which again may look a little familiar for identifying such measures in Syngap. So this surely isn't the only definition, but when we think about biomarkers, these are three of the big wickets that need to be hit. It needs to be diagnostic. It needs to be a measure that can independently distinguish disease from controls. It needs to be prognostic, measured across a disease cohort. It should give us some kind of inference of phenotypic severity. And finally, it needs to be responsive. In the same vein as inferring severity, it needs to be something that we can use to track the progress of therapies. In September, our group published a work authored by our then postdoc Peter Gaylor. In this study, we assembled a QEEG pipeline for processing recordings and extracting spectral features, providing the power bands and ratios that I mentioned earlier. After processing EEG recordings, the targeted monogenic cohorts and patients dubbed healthy controls after screening ICD-10 codes from electronic medical records, we conducted a battery of random forest analyses to create a classifier for each genetic etiology. I would encourage you to look further into this, but as Jay has done before, I will just show you the output of our Syngap model, which should look pretty familiar. So here I have two different plots contextualizing the performance of the model, and I'll walk you through this a little bit. On the left, we have an ROC curve. This model was run twice, first with only global features shown in red, with an AUC of 0.75, which is already quite good. And then we ran it again, informing it with the spatially differentiated features, which further improved the AUC to 0.86, demonstrating that our model can classify Syngap patients from control with high fidelity. To the right, you have a feature importance plot, and without delving too much into semantics, this shows you the top 8 features that the model used to inform its predictions. The higher the Gini index shown on the y-axis, the more useful this feature was as informing the model's prediction. And so we can see we have a clear winner here in the alpha-theta ratio reported from the occipital region. And in fact, this graph almost doesn't really do it justice because the axis doesn't actually stop at 1. That was only chosen to kind of illustrate the rest of them as box plots. The median for our top feature is actually closer to 4. So with that, we have a model that with EEG features alone can predict SYNGAP patients from controls, and we have a strong front runner among features contributing to the model. So models are excellent tools, but as a skeptic, my first question was, is this something that we can actually measure? So from the same data set, we had 855 control EEGs from almost as many patients and 45 SYNGAP1 recordings from 21 patients. So here to preserve independence, I pulled only a single EEG from each SYNGAP patient and age matched them to the 3 closest age patients in the control cohort. Shown here is the larger dots in the scatter plot, which you can see largely group around 2 to 5 years of age. After testing for differences between the two groups across all of our 54 spectral features, these were the only terms that survived multiple testing correction. And those are occipital alpha theta, parietal alpha theta, and occipital alpha. All 3 of these were in the feature importance plot that we saw before. And probably tired of hearing about different acquisition technologies, but one caveat that is probably worth mentioning before we move forward is that our EEGs come to us from 2 different ways. Our clinical EEGs come from the traditional 1020 system, and our research EEGs come from this geodesic array I'll introduce in a second. There are many technical differences between these two, but when considering the clinical EEGs, the most important to mention are probably that there are only 19 scalp electrodes and that these are actually installed by licensed EEG technicians. In our ENDD research clinic, we have a 128 electrode array assembled in an easily adorned elastic cap, which sort of represents like a swimmer's cap. And these are put on by our, generally by our research coordinating team, who are trained but are not qualified technicians. So it seemed like a prudent question to ask, is the signal preserved across acquisition technologies? And the answer is yes. Here I'm showing you our occipital alpha theta measure, which is now shown across 3 broad age range with the controls in gray, our clinical SYNGAP recordings in dark purple, and the lighter purple being our research recordings. You can see that there is very little difference between both our SYNGAP cohorts. So our candidate measure can be adequately detected with 2 different technologies. So revisiting our biomarker discussion, with this work we have a definite candidate in that we are able to show diagnostic potential in EEG feature that is robust across detection methods. And so now the question moves to how do we measure prognostic potential among this feature or other features? So next I'm going to show you some of our first looks at trying to explore this question, looking for correlations between, looking between correlations, there it is. Looking between correlations of features in EEG features and outcome measure correlations. Our clinic, the Center for Epilepsy and Neurodevelopmental Disorders, or ENDD, serves as the headquarters for the largest prospective natural history study for SYNGAP1 related disorders. We see enrolled patients every 6 months and longitudinally evaluate a comprehensive spectrum of disease domains. For sake of time, I will stick to the relevant details, which can be summed up in saying we conduct a catalog of developmental assessments, document retrospective seizure histories, and collect EEG features recorded, our EEG recordings at every visit. As our first outcome measure, I'm showing you here some scores that should look familiar from Alicia Harrison's earlier talk. The scores from 2 developmental assessments, the Bailey-4, which is split up into 5 different subdomains, and the GMFM66. This data is composed of 100 SYNGAP1 patients across a total of 191 visits, and here dots are color-coded by visit number with lines linking tests that were from the same patient. We took the scores from baseline developmental assessments shown on the y-axis, paired them with our catalog of EEG features shown on the x-axis, and ran correlation tests for all the pairings that I'm showing you here in the heat map. Stars are marking cases where there were p-values were below 0.05, and cells are colored by the correlation metric row. If we go looking for the winner of our model's feature importance, we see that the occipital alpha theta does indeed show some correlations, and in fact when we measure it against the GMFM66 we see it as the most significant pairing of all 366 correlation tests. And here's just a look at the, here's a look at the underlying data. This indicates that there is a notable direct association between the particular assessment and feature pairing. For our second outcome measure, we looked at our seizure reconstruction data. But first, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a setup. So center screen, you have a mock-up of a simple scatter plot where I'm showing you where each row is stemming from the y-axis in a single patient. And along the x-axis, we are longitudinally traversing through this patient's seizure history 1 month at a time. Color and dot size here are representing the seizure frequency this patient had in each month, demonstrated in the legend to the right. With that said, here's the reconstruction of seizure frequencies across our entire cohort of 100 SYNGAP patients from ages 0 to 8. Again, following the y-axis, every row is a patient, and each individual dot represents 1 month aligned along the x-axis by patient age. In its entirety, this data set represents 807 patient years, and here I'm showing you the data at the resolution of the most general seizure term, but for any single individual patient in any window, we can capture this for the entire catalog of unique seizure terms that we have in the cohort. We see this patient's seizure profile within this window was mostly constituent of eyelid myoclonia and atonic seizures. So this is all quite exploratory at the moment, but as an example, I will show you an approach where we have taken the mean seizure frequency score measured for each patient and each seizure term, performing the same correlation tests as before. So here I've trimmed this down to just the top level seizure term and the 3 most common seizure types we found in the cohort, again running correlation tests. Looking back to our occipital alpha theta measure, we don't see a signal this time. And there are many other putative correlations here, predominantly coming from our atonic seizure mean scores, with our top pairing this time in the frontal beta delta ratio. So this was a little disheartening to see, but borrowing from the clinical knowledge on our team, this is starting to look more like good news than bad news. Over the last several years, there's a growing body of evidence that anti-seizure medications have distinct pharmacological effects as they pertain to EEG. And we are currently finalizing a companion data set to our seizure history that will compose all the ASMs prescribed to each patient longitudinally. But at the moment, seeing no correlation in our occipital alpha theta measure here may mean that this measure is robust against the effects that we see with ASMs. And measures more like our frontal beta delta could be incredibly sensitive to this. So to quickly recap, I gave you a quick background on EEG, which is a non-invasive and accessible test. We looked at how QEEG approaches like spectral feature analysis can extract meaningful measures from complex data. We took a look at some of the more recent modeling approaches which demonstrated occipital alpha theta as a strong candidate biomarker of differentiating Syngap from controls. And finally, occipital alpha theta shows correlations with developmental assessments, chiefly the GMFM66. Put together, this creates a strong candidacy profile for occipital alpha theta as a biomarker in SYNGAP1 related disorders. And with that, I would like to say thank you to my lab and to the broader ENDD team. And if there's time permitting, I would take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was impressive. And you need that context of the PROMISE study to be able to interpret all of the signatures. So, yeah,
Absolutely.
Well done. Questions? Again, there. Can you read EEG with those glasses?
I need the glasses. As you know, I'm a big fan. I have a question for you. You probably saw this coming. Sure. I'm curious if it would be possible. So you did this by removing the spatial data, so it's sort of average, right? And it's still a pretty good model without that. So I would imagine our headband would be somewhere between no spatial data and then the very detailed spatial data of 1020 or even 1010. Or I don't even know if that was 10.5, some very detailed EEG. Would it be possible to strip down your data set to like basically mimic our 4 electrodes and then rerun models and see how well it performed? Is that even theoretically?
That's an interesting question. I think conceptually it should be pretty easy to do. I think when to try to get the 1020 data and our research data to kind of look the same, we ended up doing some like local averaging and like downscaling to try to replicate the same kind of like locality that we see in 1020. So I imagine the same kind of approach could be employed for any kind of locality we want to look at. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, perfect.
So when you train your model, this is you're only training with the SYNGAP data, right? Or is it trained across developmental epileptic encephalopathies? How do you distinguish between signatures?
Sure. So if you actually go and look at the paper, we actually did run some models towards the end of it where we tried to look at 3 genetic etiologies at the same time. But the random forest that I showed you here and the ones at the beginning of the study focused mostly on control versus a single monogenic etiology.
Sorry, and I apologize, I haven't read the paper. I'm glad you exist because there's so much data and it all comes to you, I assume. How close are we to you training an algorithm that you can let loose on your bank of EEGs and saying, Syngap, SCX, SDX, blah, 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 and then crossing those records with, this one has Syngap per the algorithm, has not been tested, let's test them. Is that like next week, next month? How are
Yeah, I think it would be hard to put a timeline on that. I think like our lab currently is working on kind of like a 2-pronged approach, right? So we look at these like monogenic conditions where we have to go through all of our like CHOP EEGs, we have to identify the correct patients, and we have to build these very focused cohorts. On the other end, we're kind of working from the other direction where we're just trying to pull the entire archive of data that we have, which ends up being like over 100,000 EEGs. And we are kind of just trying to see with patient data married to that, like what can we learn from it? So I think what you're talking about is somewhere meeting in the middle of those 2 things, right? A timeline, I don't know, but we're going to have that data for the bigger data set probably early next year. And we'll be able to start learning lessons from that.